It is Thursday, May 26th. This is This Non-Religious Life. On tonight's episode, we explore the Bible. Who wrote it? What they wrote? What they left out? And what books were forgeries?
Hey everyone, welcome to this week's episode of This Non-Religious Life. I'm your host Ken. With me is our co-host Jason.
Hello.
And our other co-host Bob.
Hello.
Seductive.
And this week we're going to be talking about the Bible.
No, we talk
authors
about that
and
every
fabricators. Yeah, I know, right? No, this week we're talking about the Bible itself, not crazy people reading into the Bible, not doomsday predictions from the Bible, not... I can't think of anything else we've covered on this show other than the Bible. But this week we're talking about the Bible itself. Mostly authenticity. This came from, if you were watching last Saturday on The Talking Dead, the three of us were on, and right at the end we started to get talking about how it's more advantageous for people who were writing the books of the Bible to pretend to be someone they weren't. So, you were about to say something when we were getting no.
Oh well, I'll save it for the discussion.
Okay, so I think the best thing to do here.
And I was drinking then, so
you were.
Start telling what I said.
So I guess the best thing to do right now is just go over what the traditional stance on authorship is in the Bible, to give, a sort of a starting platform to go from. So traditionally, the books of the Bible are attributed to various biblical figures and early church leaders. So, you have the four Gospels by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul, where Matthew was the tax collector turned disciple. Mark was a secretary of Paul. Luke was a sometimes traveling companion of... Mark was the secretary of Peter. Luke was the sometimes traveling companion of Paul. He also traditionally is said to have written Acts. And then there was John, who was the beloved disciple. And it's attributed to him the three epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John.
So we have a tax collector and a secretary.
Yes.
Okay.
Then we have the epistles. So there's Jude, who was said to be the brother of Jesus. 1st and 2nd Peter were said to be written by Peter, the disciple. You have Paul writing supposedly 14 epistles. Hebrews is sometimes debated, but the other 13 are his. You have James, who just calls himself a servant of the Lord, and then you have John of Patmos, who wrote Revelation. This is a different John, even in tradition. This is a different John than the John who wrote the Gospel and the three epistles. So that is, and this really comes out of the fact that, the early church wanted to solidify their canon. So they took a bunch of books, and sometimes there were names attached to them already, and sometimes they just sort of attach names to them to give them more gravity, the ability to build a whole canon around them.
So none of these guys were the 12 disciples. These were apostles later.
Well, the 12 disciples became the 12 apostles.
Okay.
The disciples were just followers of Jesus. The apostles were disciples who Jesus then put into positions of power over the church when he left. So Peter was an apostle.
Okay.
as was supposedly Matthew, and so was John.
Right. All right, but I'm just thinking about like the the picture we all had of the Last Supper, and we talk about first person accounts. So
Supposedly Peter's there, John is there, and Matthew is there. So they're the big three as far as eyewitness accounts. Paul also called himself an apostle, but he wasn't one of the 12.
but are they writing first person accounts or not?
No, none of these are first person accounts, and that's what we're going to get into now because, like I said, so
I'm a little confused. I'm a little confused. Like you say they were there, but then this is not a first person account.
It's the traditional account. So the Gospels themselves were written anonymously. There are no names in the Gospel saying, I am so-and-so writing this account of what I saw. In fact, actually, in Luke, you get something that's completely the opposite. Luke all but admits at the beginning of his Gospel that he is just basing his entire account on previous accounts that he's been able to collect. So, like, when you open up the Gospel of Matthew, the words at the top of the page, Evangelion kata Matthew in Greek, that was added there later. Originally, it was an account of Jesus, and then people later on, to provide an amount of gravity for it, placed Matthew's name on it as a traditional authorship. And that's the way it is with with at least certainly Matthew, Mark, and John. Luke is a little debatable. There are good arguments that Luke actually wrote his Gospel and Acts, because whoever wrote Luke also wrote Acts. The two stories flow into each other. They use the same Christology, the same eschatology. They reference Jesus in the same way. The writing style, the grammar, structurally, it's all very the same. Like, it's like when you're reading books by the same author, you can always see like they have a certain style about them.
Right. I can see that.
Luke and Acts are definitely written by the same person. The argument that it was written by Luke is one because Luke is kind of a nobody. There's no real serious reason to take Luke and be like, pretend to be Luke, because he's only mentioned twice by Paul, and it's sort of in passing. So there's an argument that it might date to the right period. But as for Matthew, Mark, and John, they're absolute, just completely anonymous authors. No one knows who wrote them, and names.
And why are they attributed to them?
Well, there was a lot of writing in the first couple centuries around after the crucifixion. So when in the 4th century, Christians were seriously starting to get serious about having to make one canon of literature that is authoritative, because a lot of the stuff, even in the canon we have, a lot of it contradicts itself in different places. Different books will say different things. The view of salvation in Paul's letter to the Ephesians and Paul's letter to, say, the Galatians is completely different. And that's because they were written by different people.
Okay, all right.
So what they did is they would, because there was so much stuff, they would take things that were attributed to specific people and then say, well, this is the work of, Mark. He's important. He traveled with Peter. His work should definitely be in the canon.
Okay, well let's start at the beginning then. Let's pick a guy. Let's pick, say, Paul. And what is his story? What is his relationship? Where does he fit in the chronology and the historicity of it all? And let's see what was written, like what is attributed to him. What do we believe he did right? What do we think that he didn't, and why?
Okay.
Which, right before we do that, let's ask the question, why do we care who wrote it?
Well, it matters. I mean, when you're taking a piece of literature like this, I mean, any literature, people debate about who wrote Shakespeare, which I think is a stupid argument.
But
anyway,
they can debate who wrote writings, but it doesn't change the writing. So who really cares about?
It changes
who
the
wrote
writing as soon as you say that it's the inerrant word of God. You know,
I agree. Like as soon as you say that it's divinely inspired and it's the inerrant word of a deity, then it becomes important. Then we can ask the questions of who wrote it and why.
Yeah.
But if it was inspired, it still doesn't matter who wrote it.
Well, the whole point of it being inspired is they're saying it was inspired because it was written by this person. I mean, it's not. I mean, if the whole argument was that it was just inspiration, they wouldn't need to attribute it to certain people. But the fact that they did shows that, this isn't necessarily inspired word. It's an argument to authority, is what they're placing all of the crux of the Bible on.
So you're saying, like, for example, if for whatever proof that we have that you were given this inspiration by Christ or by God to write something, 10 years down the road, we say Bob wrote it. It doesn't make any difference. I mean, the difference that it makes is that it could be falsified because he wasn't inspired to write what happened to you.
Well, I think the difference is that if you say something is divinely inspired, that's one thing, and then you might even be right. I don't know, but I think that if you make an argument that something's divinely inspired, then someone else can tear that argument down by looking at the writing and saying, no, this wasn't divinely inspired. It was actually written by a person at a specific time who had motivations to write what they write, reasons to write what they write that are concrete and purely secular.
Yeah.
And that takes away divine inspiration. I mean, if you show that, well, okay, yeah, you wrote something 10 years ago, and like J.K. Rowling, you can place her at a coffee shop writing Harry Potter because she had these ideas of a book in her head, and you can look at what was going on in her life at that time and
see the reference.
See those inspirations show up in her writing. It doesn't mean that it's divinely inspired, even though she has made more money than the Queen.
Yeah. But that makes sense because I've been to that in Scotland. I've been to that cafe, and the table that she supposedly sat at is a window where you can see the Castle of Edinburgh. And when we sat there and looked at that view, you can see where the inspiration for the film. So I see you make a valid point by saying, it does make sense that we have to. Who wrote it does have purpose.
Yeah, well, it's not just who wrote it, but who wrote it and why.
Yeah,
for example,
that's true.
When you compare, say, the Acts of the Apostles and what happens in there, compared with what Paul writes in 1st and 2nd Galatians. So if you compare Acts 9 through 15 and what Luke says there with what Paul says in Galatians 1 and 2, you can see that there's, Paul has an axe to grind about certain things, but Luke is sort of like, he sort of whitewashes everything, and he makes it seem like Jerusalem is more important than Paul makes it out to be, and there's a centricity and like a oneness within the church that you don't get from Paul, who was actually there. So let's start with Paul, because the critical view is Paul supposedly wrote in tradition either 13 or 14, depending on if you attribute Hebrews to him, and there's authentic Pauline literature, there's debated Pauline literature, and then there's the pastoral epistles, which were not written by Paul at all. And the authentic Pauline literature are 7 epistles: Romans, Galatians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philemon, Thessalonians, and Philippians. They're all written sometime between 50 and 70, and these are the first documents written in the New Testament. I mean, they are the oldest pieces. 1 Thessalonians was written, I believe, in 53 CE, so only about 23 years after the crucifixion. Very old.
I think it's important to point out, when you say what Thessalonians and Corinthians and in Romans is those are referring to. They're basically Paul's letters. Right?
Yeah, they're
an
epistle is a letter.
It's not like he's writing a novel. He's writing a letter to the faithful, addressing some concern, and I think it's I'm not finished with it yet, but I'm still reading it in Ehrman's book, misquoting Jesus. He mentions that, you know, as bookish as Christianity was, and how it relied on textual what do you want to call that, textual teachings, or I mean, it relied on the written word. Largely the people were illiterate.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's something that'll come up later, because, you know, Peter supposedly wrote 2 books, but I mean, he was an illiterate fisherman. You
Right.
know?
Well, and that's another point that Ehrman makes too. Is that we have we're looking at it through the lens of modern culture, when our definition of literacy and our acceptance of what's in a book is much different than what it was then. And he pointed out, like, there was some a particular scribe. This was this guy's job. He was a scribe, and all he could do was write the words like, "I am the scribe, I approve this," and that was all he could write, and that was considered literate. He could write one sentence, not even very well, and that was the definition of literacy.
Wow. Yeah, and I mean, something like these were all written in Greek. I mean, that was part of the whole thing about the New Testament literature, was it was written in Greek. If you had a piece of New Testament literature that was written in Aramaic or Hebrew or Latin, when it came time for canonization of the literature, anything that wasn't written in Greek was immediately thrown out. And the Greeks wrote in something called scriptio continua, which is literally all capital letters, no spaces. So it was meant to be read aloud. So
yeah, that was another point that Ehrman makes, is that those early texts were no punctuation, no spaces between words. It was just letter after letter after letter after letter, and so how do you even interpret that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, exactly. If you write the words "God is now here" with no spaces, all capitals, you can also read it as "God is nowhere."
Right.
You know, it's very difficult. It lends to a lot of problems later on when scribes would go through and rewrite these letters. But the second set of Pauline letters are 2 Thessalonians, Ephesians, and Colossians. And this is where it gets interesting, because Colossians was written around 65. And these are disputed for different reasons, because 2 Thessalonians, it's written in the Pauline style. It seems very Paulish, but he's writing a second letter to the church in Thessalonica. But the problem is he goes over, sometimes verbatim, the things that he talked about in his first letter. If Paul was writing a second letter to a church like he did to the Corinthians, he's not going to quote himself again. You know, he's going to elaborate slightly. So it seems like someone wanted to create a letter to include, and they took 1 Thessalonians and they used it as a model for what they wanted to do and ended up quoting from it. But because they're not Paul, it's easier to attach Paul's name to it to give it credibility.
Yeah.
Ephesians and Colossians is a lot easier to debunk, because Ephesians and Colossians are written in a very elegant Greek style. Like the introduction to Ephesians is it's like 250 words in Greek, one sentence, which is an amazing Greek sentence. Like that's how like educated Greek philosophers wrote. And Paul wasn't that. Paul dictated what he had to say to a scribe, who then wrote it, and then Paul would sign very sloppily at the end of his letter. Like it says in, I believe it's Galatians, at the end of Galatians, it says, "See by my large letters that this is written by my own hand," dictated to the scribe. Like, so it's argued that Colossians came first and then Ephesians followed, because they have different, they're, other than being more elegantly written and definitely not in the grammatical style of Paul, the eschatology is different. Like the idea that Paul said that when you die, you have a reserved eschatology. Like, you die and then you go, and then at Judgment Day, you'll be judged as to whether or not you're saved or not. Whereas Colossians and Ephesians actually say that you can be saved right now, which is a very different theological perspective on the end times. The final one, these three right here, the final version of Paul, is these three books are absolutely, almost completely undisputedly not Paul's, and that's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. They don't match Paul's style. They don't match Paul's theology. They don't match Paul's Christology. And they're all written much later, all around the turn of the century in the second, to the 2nd century. And this is dated because in the 2nd century, around 130, there was he was a merchant who became a Christian leader named Marcion. And he was the first Christian to actually put together his own canon of literature. And what it was Luke and then 10 of Paul's epistles. The 3 of Paul's epistles that were omitted were 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which means if they were attributed to Paul and he knew about them, he would have used them. He loved Paul. But it seems that he was completely unaware of their existence, which dates them much later.
It's tomato slicing time.
Yep.
It's tomato slicing time, guys.
But I don't think we have issues with that.
The last thing is the epistle to the Hebrews, and this is always attached to Paul, or sometimes attached to Paul.
So, I'm sorry. I have one more question before we move away from Paul. So some of the Gospels of Paul,
the epistles of Paul,
the epistles of Paul, we could show that they were written how many years after?
Close to 40, at least.
40 years
I mean,
after?
maybe they could have been written even later. That's the thing. I mean, Marcion put together his canon in 130, so you can argue that they may not even been around in 130, but placing them at around the year 100 means that they could have existed but not been in wide circulation yet.
And how old would that make Paul?
Paul would have been close to 100 years old.
And that's plausible
90 years old. I mean, yeah, considering the average life expectancy was 35.
No,
I know it's a simplistic
simplistic
argument, but I'm just like, the math doesn't add up.
No, it doesn't. And that's the thing. Like, I mean, the faithful really hate when you start pointing out the chronology of when things were written, because it really starts to throw a monkey wrench. You know, when you say, well, Luke wasn't written until at least 85. And it's like, that was 55 years after the crucifixion. I mean, assuming Luke was 5 at the crucifixion, you know, he would have been, 60 years old when he wrote his account.
Well, going back to the question that when we were talking about why is it important to know who wrote this, and you said that so we can know what's going on and kind of get an insight of why it was written. Where's the answer? Why was this written?
A lot of it was written because Christian churches in the first couple centuries were, they were vastly different. They had different communities of different people dealing with different problems. Like sexual impropriety was a really big thing in Corinth. So, Paul would write to them and tell them about proper sexual behavior as Christians.
In where?
In Corinth.
Corinth.
So
okay.
This is the first and second epistles to the Corinthians. But the chain letter that went to Galatia, which is a whole area, it's not a city, it's a big area in what's now Turkey, populated by people from Gaul who came down from France and Germany and settled into Asia Minor. He dealt with completely different things. When whoever wrote to the Hebrews was dealing more with apostasy and persecution than sexual impropriety. They were each letter is written to a different group of people dealing with a different set of problems, because each church, and the word church is horribly anachronistic, because there were no churches. Like, these were people's houses where you had a patron and then maybe some slaves and some like peasants who would gather together at night and do their thing. It was very much like a mystery cult.
Yeah, so I get this from my understanding of how these things occurred. I get it from Ehrman, and the way he puts it is that each letter was like, if they heard of an issue within a church community, and we'll call it a church, then somebody, and let's say it was Paul, would write a letter saying, well, this is what we think, this is how you should behave, this is how you should believe.
So it started off as like a moral code for community.
Yeah, the epistles were meant to be read aloud during like congregation services.
Right? Doesn't he? Ehrman cites some instances where even in the letter it says, "Get everybody around and read this letter," because this is. And that was what they would do. He's like, read this to as many people as possible. Because, again, you have to consider that I think they said the literacy rate was like 10 to 15%.
It was
very
low.
That was with that, sort of, fast and loose definition of literacy. And so, since you couldn't be in all places at once, the apostles would write the letter addressing their concerns to whatever that community had going on.
So this was just the...
Again, these guys aren't writing novels.
This was the original grassroots activist type method.
Pretty much.
Yeah, very similar. Paul and Paul would wander around. He would found churches in different cities he would go to. When he was in Ephesus, he would found a church. When he was in Corinth, he would found a church. When he was in Thessalonica, he would found a church. And then he would maintain contact with them by writing letters to them. And we have, assumably he wrote way more letters than we have, but these are the ones that ended up surviving.
And this is why I would argue that these letters weren't written out of divine inspiration; they were written out of necessity.
Yeah,
very much so.
It's the first franchise.
Yeah.
Paul is the second largest contributor to the New Testament, only behind Luke. When you combine Luke and Acts together, you have a quarter of the New Testament right there.
So you said that all these other writings are contributed to Paul, but really can't be because of writing styles and time period,
grammar.
Is this why Paul was picked? Because of his...
Paul was picked because he was famous in the early church. He was maybe the most prolific person in the early church. He was going around constantly founding new churches. He was constantly writing letters. The fact that we have 7 authentic letters that are Paul's shows, that's something we can't say about anyone else in the entire Bible.
We have the document itself that was touched by Paul, written by Paul.
But there is scholarly consensus that those first 7 are by the same person who signed his name as Paul.
Those first 7.
But we don't. But we don't have the.
They date to the right period. You can tell in a document tradition, you can tell how old a document is based on how widespread it was used, and who was citing from it.
All right, but my question is this a primary source material, or do we have copies of his letters?
We only have copies of his letters.
So we don't have the original letters. We have copies of the copies of the copies.
Yeah.
All right, I just want to make that point clear.
That's what they would do, especially like with Galatians. Galatians was a letter that Paul wrote, and he probably had several scribes in front of him. I say wrote loosely. Scribes wrote it. His Greek was not very good, his written Greek wasn't very good. So he would have scribes write his letters, and then he sent them out to Galatia, to these various towns. We don't know what towns they went to. And then those people would write them and pass them along. And then those people would write them and pass them along. And so you have like sort of like a branching out network of these letters getting rewritten and copied. And I mean, this work was done by people who weren't professional scribes. They were members of the Christian community who could read and write and were capable of doing so and willing to do so.
Okay, you said it's a point of clarity,
Yes,
and I think it's an important distinction to make. That, when you say we have these letters, that's not necessarily true. We have copies of the copies of the copies.
And I mean, if you want to make that point, the important point to make is that is the most authentic version of anything we have in the New Testament is Paul's first 7 letters.
And it's not that authentic.
Hey, all right, so and this is Galatians, you said?
Yeah, Galatians was a chain letter. It was written to an entire area, as opposed to Thessalonians, which is written to a specific church inside a city.
This is not a chain letter like we get today, though.
No, it's similar, actually.
Yeah, kind of.
Promises of, supernatural things happening if
And
you
if you
copy it
don't.
10 times and pass it to your friends.
Holy shit!
No, that is kind of what it was.
Yeah,
That's
it
exactly
really
what
was.
it is. I don't think that analogy is too far off the
No.
mark. So can you speak to his motivations in these letters?
It depends on the letter.
Fair enough.
Like I said, he was addressing different things in different churches. Generally, Paul had a very specific Christology of Jesus as God. So it's very orthodox in that. He wanted to be seen. He had sort of a complex about being seen as less than the other apostles. He always likes to say that he wasn't parroting what he heard from Peter or from James or from whoever else. He was getting his revelation straight from Jesus because he had a vision of Jesus who told him everything.
But okay, all right. So he says he saw something.
He was writing for fame, sometimes, I guess. He was writing because he wanted to be seen as a head of the church.
So not much has changed with.
Yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, it seems that's an interesting part of human nature. So I mean,
Yeah.
Well, another interesting point that Ehrman makes is about you kind of what you get as Christian canon is the guys who won. And,
Definitely.
And to say that Paul was writing all these letters, well, there was another guy who was writing the same letters, maybe with a contrary view. And in fact, he says that there's instances where there's infighting, where one guy writing a letter says, "Oh, well, don't believe this other guy because he's a heretic," and then at the same time, that guy's pointing the finger the exact same way, saying, "No, you got to do it this way because that guy is a heretic, and I have the true knowledge." And it was like this battle of who was right.
Absolutely.
And those letters we still have some of them. They just weren't included in
We have a
canon.
lot of them. We have a ton of them actually.
And that would be good for our project.
We have
Note.
the Gospel of Judas. We have the Gospel of Thomas. We have the Apocalypse of Peter. Which actually, the Apocalypse of Peter, at the time of the canonization of the whole Bible, the Apocalypse of Peter was actually more widespreadly taught than the Apocalypse of John, which we now have. But they taught different things.
Yeah, well, that's a very Howard Zinn idea. History is written by the victors, and those guys won. I guess maybe Paul won because he wrote the most letters, and it was the most available. And
He was.
Or just the
really
right
like
people at the
Paul.
right time picked up the right letter, and it happened to be it.
And I mean, you see that actually in the letters of John, where John talks about these antichrists, these people that are false prophets that go around teaching false teachings, and you shouldn't listen to them. You should listen to him because he has the true revelation from Jesus.
right, but everybody said that they had the true knowledge.
Exactly.
But they still say that. That's why we have the Recovery Bible.
And the English Standard Version.
But even the Recovery Bible says that it's the right one.
No, that's what I'm saying. And we still have that
All of
that
them.
that in battle still going.
Yeah, right. I mean, who can?
So.
But soon this non-religious life will enlighten all. Foreshadowing.
You're gonna give it away.
Don't give it away.
So I think we can jump off Paul for a second. Just with a quick comment. I mentioned Hebrews earlier. Hebrews is an interesting letter. It's kind of attributed to Paul sometimes. When you open the Bible and you flip open to the epistles, the Pauline epistles, they're organized not in order of how he wrote them, but in order of length, the longest being first and the shortest being last. And then right after Philemon, which is the shortest of his epistles, about 2 pages long, you have the epistle to the Hebrews, which is much longer. But there is, unlike when Paul would write something, he would say, "This is Paul writing to you." There is no name in Hebrews. It's traditionally attributed to Paul because he was such a prolific writer, and because he was the apostle too.
He was the go-to guy.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess we can jump to the Gospels. The Gospels, just like Hebrews, the Gospels are completely anonymous. There's no one in there saying, this is so-and-so, with the exception of the end of the Gospel of John. But the oldest versions of the Gospel of John completely omit the last chapter, the 21st chapter, where it says, this is written by John, the beloved disciple. That was added possibly centuries later.
And what's the implication there?
The implication is that, just like the other Gospels, it's anonymous. It was written by somebody who didn't have a name to put on it and didn't want to write, pseudepigraphically.
Don't use big words.
Yeah, it's a tongue twister. They didn't want to ghostwrite something. They didn't want to write it and say, well, this is Mark, because they didn't do that. They just wrote what they had based on, Mark was based on oral traditions and dates to about 65, so about 35 years after the crucifixion. And, I mean, about 15 years after Paul starts writing his letters. So right around the end of Paul's writing career, you have the first gospel written. About 15 years later, you have 2 more gospels written, and that's Matthew and Luke. And both use Mark as a sort of like archetype. You know, they take Mark, because Mark's whole gospel is just a passion narrative with an extended introduction. You know, most of it has to do with, the trial of Jesus and the crucifixion. And there's not even a resurrection narrative in the original version of Mark. It ends at chapter 16, verse 8. The last 12 verses, which we find in modern Bibles, were added, again, centuries later, to harmonize it with Matthew and Luke, who ended up putting in a whole resurrection narrative.
Okay, well that's cool. Let's jump into Mark, man. What is Mark's story?
Well, Mark, like I said, it's anonymously written, but they attribute it to Mark, who was the secretary to Peter, and Peter was the head of the church, or the head of the church. Jesus says, "This is the rock I'll build my church on," because Peter is it means rock. Peter is sometimes called Cephas, and Cephas means rock.
I thought Dwayne.
It's a nice little play on words. It's really funny, actually, when you read the Bible. There are so many, like, the ancient Jews were so good with wordplay. Like, it is incredible the way they would spin puns into things. It's maybe it's just funny to me because I'm a big fucking nerd.
It's funny to you.
So it was written about 65. It's very short. It's the shortest of the Gospels. It's only 16 chapters. Each of the chapters is, they're not very long. But this is the first written account of Jesus' life. Paul never mentions the life of Jesus.
Right.
He never gets into a birth narrative. He never gets into a passion narrative. He never, for Paul, everything starts at the resurrection. But for Mark, it was more framing the biography of Jesus.
Now, is Mark telling a narrative story, or is he like Paul writing letters to address concerns in the church?
This is a narrative story. This is a biography. This is like something Plutarch would write, or Suetonius, or any of the other biographers of that time.
But we gotta clarify, like as we did in previous episodes, that when you think of a biography, it is not what we think of a biography of today.
Biographies and histories are two different things. When Plutarch was writing, it's very different from what Tacitus was writing. Tacitus and Josephus were historians. They wrote history. The gospel writers are biographers. They're writing about someone, and they want to show the person's character. Whether or not those stories are made up whole cloth, it didn't matter so long as they showed the essence of the person they were talking about.
I'm hoping that Michael Bay does my biography.
Yes, it would be.
I think it'd be
in
awesome.
3D.
You know.
Well, I mean, what it seems like to me is that you're writing the death speech of somebody that you would give out to the family, at the funeral. You're not going to say, you're going to include some factual stuff, but you're going to always highlight the best moments of the person's character, not of you're not.
Yeah, but this goes beyond just embellishment. I mean, this is some of the accusation that I've read about the was it Mark, is that what he does in his biographical narrative is he combines common mythologies of the time.
Yeah, I mean the whole savior myth, very loosely. There are people out there who like to really harp on it and start pulling in all sorts of facts which don't necessarily correlate, and that's areas where I disagree with people like Robert Price and stuff like that. Not this one.
No, different.
Different one.
We always agree with you.
It's but the savior mythology was common going back for a long time. I mean, Horace, and very similar. There was the personal salvation part of Christianity was very much adopted from a sort of archetype that was floating in the air. It's very amorphous, and Christianity made its own thing out of it.
Right, but he's not eulogizing a person, which I think that's where you're going. Like yeah, you only tell the good stuff, and you make it seem maybe a little better than it is. It's my understanding that some of the things are just made up whole cloth.
Absolutely. The person who wrote the person who wrote Mark was not there to see the things. He was basing everything he knew on some possible textual examples, but mostly an oral tradition that had been passed down. It was a telephone game. He may have believed a majority of what he was writing was true, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was, because it was that telephone game. And
right.
People love to claim that the oral tradition was some sort of perfect tradition where people memorize things, and it's simply not true.
That's special pleading.
It is special pleading. Christians in the first century, and especially the first half of the first century, they were peasants. They were mostly people who were very, they were illiterate, not educated. They were either slaves or recently freed men, or Jews. They were common people, working people, tradespeople and craftspeople who were not well educated and didn't have the ability to memorize whole verses of things. I mean, the amount of time it takes to memorize something like that is something that only someone who is an upper class, people like the Pharisees, could do, because Pharisees were Jewish leaders who had the time to sit down and memorize scripture. And
they had the wealth, so they could sit down.
Exactly. They had the ability to dedicate their lives to just memorizing things.
Yeah, the oral tradition argument I don't think that holds up.
Oh, it doesn't hold up by the fact that you can take various versions of the same document that were written around the same time and show that there are inconsistencies between them.
Well, we can even take this program as soon as we finish recording it, and all three of us could talk to somebody differently about what the show was about and have something completely about it.
Well, yeah, that's. But, so back to what Mark wrote. Like, what, he was writing. He was writing the biographic narrative.
Biographic narrative of Jesus' life.
After the fact.
After the fact. 35 years after the fact. Or, wait. Yeah, 35 years after the Yes. 35 years after the fact.
And I use after the fact as a saying. I want to be clear. It's an expression.
Yeah. 35 years after the supposed events, he was writing all this, and you can see it. If anyone is watching this and they were an English major at one point in time, go through and look for certain literary tricks that he does. Mark talks to the audience where he'll say, the audience knows that Jesus is the Son of God. He's the Messiah. But the characters in Mark's gospel never realize it. Whenever Jesus asks someone who he is, they get it wrong. And then he has to correct them, and then he tells them not to tell anyone. When he rebukes a demon, he commands them to be silent because they know who he is. In scholarly circles, it's called the Messianic secret.
Okay.
And it was a big literary form for Mark. That whole thing was kind of dropped by the two people that used Mark as a building block, Luke and Matthew, because they had totally different things to express. Matthew saw Jesus not necessarily as some sort of Davidic king messianic savior, but more as a new lawgiver messianic savior. He saw him as a new Moses. And in fact, you can see by the way he rearranges things in Mark, and he rearranges the order of events in Mark. You can see he takes all the speeches that Jesus gives and rearranges them into 5 distinct parts, which is very representative of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, the instructions. He has Jesus present himself as a new sort of Moses. Luke, on the other hand, presents Jesus much more as a prophet who's come. He's more of an Elisha figure who has come to usher in some sort of new age of prophecy and rebuke the powers that be the way that Elijah and Elisha did.
All right. Well, who's after Mark?
Well, after Mark, you have about 15 years of Mark being around, and then you have Matthew and Luke, which are both written around sometime between 70 and 85.
All right, and who are they, and what is their story?
Well, Matthew was supposedly the tax collector turned disciple. Again, it's anonymous who wrote it. There's no name attached to the earliest versions. Name was attached later to give it credence over the other competing Gospels. Luke was arguably written by Luke, the secretary to, or the traveling companion of Paul. Because, there's no real reason to pretend to be Luke. He wasn't a famous figure. It's kind of pointless. However, again, there's no name attached to it. So it's impossible to know for sure. Then you have about a 10 to 15 year gap between those, and those are the synoptic Gospels. They are all interrelated. Matthew and Luke rely completely on Mark. They rearrange the order of events. They take sayings from a lost series of documents known as Q, and then they rely on their own literary and oral sources. So they're very similar. They agree verbatim sometimes. Sometimes they completely disagree with each other. Sermon on the Mount appears in Matthew. There is no Sermon on the Mount in Luke, but there's a Sermon on the Plain, and they're very similar. So was it a mountain? Was it a plain? Was it a mountain? Was it a plain? Was it a mountain? Was it a plain?
I don't know.
Who knows?
Obviously, it was the Mount, because that's the one that everybody talks about.
Exactly. The final one is John, and John shows up around the year 90, maybe as late as 100. We know it's not much later than 100. The oldest piece of papyrus we have with anything on it is a fragment of the Gospel of John, which dates to around the year 120. But it was found in Egypt. Okay, it's Coptic, so it dates much later. John, again, completely anonymous, but it is way different, completely different than the Synoptics. Where in the Synoptics, Jesus is talking in short little snippets and parables. In John, he's going on these long diatribes. He's always saying something. Like, he's got these long speeches. And there's the section in John where he's on trial in front of Pilate. And that's when you know it's made up, because no one was in there with them. It's just the two of them talking to each other. And it's a long speech. And for someone who was crucified, like, almost immediately after, where do they get this information from?
Right.
Did they go bug the prefect?
But all right. So then, but then it falls into that. The believer would say, oh well, then he wrote it because he was divinely inspired to do so. And my argument about that is like, no, he wasn't divinely inspired. He had real, concrete motivation to write what he wrote.
Exactly. John was writing for a Greek audience. John's Greek it's simple, but at the same time, the ideas expressed in John are quasi-Gnostic and very proto-Neoplatonistic. And that'll blow your mind, but the way he teaches things, it's like, if you're familiar with Neoplatonism as a philosophy and you read the Gospel of John, you recognize things like that. When he talks about the logos and the proper teaching and the oneness of God. These are all things that are taken out of Neoplatonist philosophy. Now, Neoplatonism doesn't arrive on the scene for much longer, but I mean, those ideas of philosophy really start with Plato in the 5th century BC and survive in that area. So the Greeks were talking about this sort of stuff. And then at the same time, he's very Gnostic at the same time, because he talks about knowledge and knowing, and everything in John is about knowing and having this special knowledge that Jesus can grant. And that's a quasi-Gnostic property to it.
Right, but if he wasn't divinely inspired, what was his real motivation in writing it?
Well, arguably he was a Hellenistic convert to Christianity who was writing because, I mean, at that time, he was probably familiar with the Synoptic Gospels and probably familiar with Matthew, where in Matthew, Jesus gives the Great Commission when he's resurrected, and he's telling people to go out and preach the word. So John probably read that and said, I have to go preach the word, and ended up writing his own biography of Jesus to garner new converts. And this leads to what's known as the Johannine cult, which ends up authoring the first 3 epistles of John.
It reminds me of, and this is going to be, I guess, off topic, but have you read? This is the comic nerd in me coming out. But have you read the Bill Willingham Fables comics?
Mm-mm.
It's a like I said, it's a comic book, right? It's a funny book, but the premise is that the fables are living embodiments, and they gain their strength and prowess rises and falls with belief. And so the more people believe in this fable, the more powerful they are. And so one particularly crafty fable, he gets a movie made of his fable, thus putting that idea into the mainstream population, and now he's basically unkillable, right? He's immortal. So that if you were trying to promote your particular myth, you tell the awesome story.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Gospel of John is, it's maybe my favorite to read because it's very Jesus is always going somewhere and saying something awesome, and there's all this cool imagery in it, as opposed to Mark, which is a bit more bland. And that's exactly it. Like if say Mark and Matthew and John, if the synoptics are I don't know, Titanic, then like John is Avatar.
Yeah.
It's similar vein. It's a movie, but one is 3D, awesome surround sound, and the others are sort of flat, 2-dimensional.
But just like the Bible, James Cameron is bringing back Titanic to the theater in 3D. So,
that's. I think that's an interesting metaphor. I mean, I think it's an apt analogy, and so, like here's a story we've got, and people seem to have lost interest in it. Let's tell it again, only now with special effects.
And that's the thing, John. I mean, John is borderline heretical. Like, he diverges so heavily from the synoptics that it's very surprising that it was included. Because he is almost Gnostic, he is like almost very like too Greek, despite the fact that it's like the simplest Greek to write and read.
Without going too far afield, how do the faithful reconcile the differences and the errors in an inerrant, divinely inspired document?
They don't.
Was it? I mean,
most people don't know.
I guess I don't know. And that's the question I would ask.
The next book I'm going to loan you is Ehrman's Jesus Interrupted, which actually covers that.
Oh, okay.
Because most people just simply don't know. When you read the Bible, you read it book by book, or you read it on some sort of weird, like, read this verse over here, and then read this verse over here, and then read this verse over here, and then read this verse over here. So you never really encounter those.
Are you talking about the 2-year program for that?
2-year program to read the Bible? Jesus. Or, I mean, you read it in a way that when you eventually come to something that contradicts itself, you don't remember what it was. I mean, you remember similar stories, like in the Synoptics and then in John, does Jesus turn over the temple at the beginning of his ministry or at the end of his ministry?
I don't know.
Exactly. Well, one says one thing and the other says the other. But if you read it all the way through, all you remember is Jesus throws a fit at the temple.
Yeah, but I just maybe we need to get another voice with a microphone in front of it. I want to know, how would you reconcile those differences? This is supposed to be an inerrant, divinely inspired document that obviously has internal inconsistencies.
Well, I just think,
how are those reconciled?
I just think with the turnover of the table scenario, one guy just arrived late and thought he hadn't given the sermon yet.
I mean, maybe, but I wanted to. I thought it'd be good to talk about this because, we always talk about like, I don't like to call things more than what they are, right? And so let's, we're talking about Scripture. Let's find out what it is, who wrote it, who did it, and why, and let's see what it is instead of talking about what people think it is.
Yeah. And I mean, just to come back to the whole inconsistencies thing, is look at the Christmas story. We all know the Christmas story. The Christmas story is an amalgamation of two horribly conflicting accounts of Jesus' nativity from Luke and Matthew. In Matthew, you have the flight into Egypt, the slaughter of the innocents, the flight out of Egypt. In Luke, none of those happen. Jesus never goes to Egypt. Herod never kills any babies. There are no wise men in Luke. In Luke, Jesus is presented at the temple and circumcised when he's 40 days old or whatever. You can't do that in Matthew. In Matthew, it's like straight away they run away into Egypt and then come out later.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of among the faithful. I think there's a lot
Special
of head
pleading
in the
and
sand.
pandering and
La 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 la. I'm not listening to what you say because it conflicts with my beliefs.
well, these things are all taught in seminaries and divinity schools, but you'll never hear a preacher talk about them. You'll never hear someone at the pulpit talking about the inconsistencies in the Bible, despite the fact that they are taught them when they're in school.
What do you think that people don't care? I mean, obviously they care, but they don't focus on the issues of the Bible. The same for the same reason why people will give, $1.8 million of donation to Harold Camping and his doomsday prediction.
It's 18 million.
Yeah. Is it because they feel that they give the money because they, as we talked about on The Talking Dead last weekend, that it's kind of built into their belief. So if you challenge the Bible, if you challenge the mistakes or the what would be considered insane and normal life, if you challenge that, then you challenge God, and if you challenge God, you challenge your faith, and there you burn in hell.
Exactly. Well, Protestants believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God. They believe in the literal reading of the Bible as completely inerrant. And so Protestants rarely question the Bible. If it says two conflicting things, they find a way to pretzel logic it into making sense. Catholics simply never read the Bible, usually. A lay Catholic will almost never read the Bible because that's not the way the Catholic Church works.
Interesting.
So most Catholics they're familiar with the stories, but only what they hear in Mass.
Well, wasn't that why it was supposed to be in Latin?
Yes. Actually, that's why the first people who started to translate the Bible were declared heretics. Some of them were burned. It used to be a law in England. If you were to translate the Bible into English, it was punishable as heresy, which meant you got burned.
It was deliberately kept in Latin to keep it out of the hands of the common man.
Yeah.
Because the scripture was regarded as the sole province of the clergy.
Exactly. It was believed that, even in the Middle Ages, they understood that things can be read and understood in any number of ways, So they had to direct what your understanding of it was.
Yeah.
So.
Well, maybe in seminary they're told, these are the inconsistencies, and this is the hand waving you do to get them to look over here instead of, talking about it. That's just misdirection.
Smoke and mirrors. Smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, that's why all the incense.
Yeah, right. So, I think we're running out of time. It's time to conclude. I think, we covered some good ground. There are a few other things. You can always look at things like, the first and second epistles of Peter. Neither was written by Peter. 2 Peter was arguably the last thing ever written in the entire Bible. Irenaeus and Polycarp didn't know about it, and they were writing years and years later and had access to all of the canonical works. So, it arguably wasn't written until maybe even 160.
Well, certainly this has been really enlightening, and we could probably do it for another 5 hours.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
But I think you've got your point across, and it's certainly food for thought.
Yeah, definitely. There's so many good websites on there. Early Christian Writings is a great one. Gives decent range of dates as to when things were written, and so you can go there and you can look up even all the Apocrypha and stuff like that, and see all the Christian writings and when they were written. And
what about
by who?
What about other books? Because I'm really liking Misquoting Jesus by
Other
Ehrman.
books?
What about other authors?
For the book club?
For the book club, anything by Ehrman is amazing. I would recommend, actually, if you want to learn about the New Testament, you can actually go onto iTunes University, and Yale puts out Intro to the New Testament with Professor Dale Martin, who's the distinguished professor of New Testament studies there. And I would honestly just download the videos. They're free, and you can watch them, and it's a really good way to understand New Testament literature and early church history.
Okay. Nice.
Cool. All right. I think we're all done. And remember, you can always contact us if you have any questions, if you want us to go over something again, or you want to call us out and call us liars and
Liars!
And whatever.
Godless heathens.
You can
Killers.
Or you can just
email
come
us.
and just join us.
Yeah, right. You can
Or,
just
how about, or add something.
add something to the debate.
Right, add something intelligent to the debate, because
You
I'd
know,
love to hear it.
Make a video, send it to us.
Make sure you have clothes on.
Yes, please. You can call the Zombie Popcorn Hotline, which is what we'll get the voicemail on. And it'll be area code 757-337-2195. You can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/thisnonreligiouslife.
I wonder if there's a dislike button on Facebook.
Not yet.
I wonder how many of those we'll get.
And you can always email us at nonreligious@zombie-popcorn.com. If you want to watch us make fun of the rapture, please go to zombie-popcorn.com. You can watch last week's video of The Talking Dead, where the three of us had a 2-hour discussion about the rapture and why we're still here.
But we are still here, but
All the Christians are still here.
no.
Harold Camping's still here.
Bob may soon leave us
Yeah. I've got
until the 21st of next month.
until the 21st.
We're trying to raise $1.5 million, and if we don't get it, we kill Bob. So just head over to the Zombie Popcorn Netcast website. Give us donations if you want Bob to survive. If not, who cares?
You should set up an alternate tab like here's money, shut up and kill him already.
Excellent. But anyway,
All right.
have a good night.
All right, good day.
Got out here.
I thought I was a good Christian.
Jesus died on a cross. I go to church every Sunday. Just got out here. Then I read that Jesus died on a cross for a rotten hooker.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday.
I thought I was a good Christian.
I go to church every Sunday. I'm a very religious person.
I thought I was a good Christian. The very lies the serpent told to Eve in the Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. Garden of Eden. The gospel of Jesus Christ spreads confusion and promotes lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ spreads confusion and promotes lies. The gospel of Jesus Christ spreads confusion and promotes lies. The gospel of